Hey there, it's Christopher, and in today's episode, I'm looking at owners who got eaten by their pets. From a mechanic in the Nevada desert who pushed his luck handling a 15-foot python one time too many, to an elementary school teacher whose encounter with a chimpanzee ended in a violent and unexpected attack. It was August 17, 2014, and the Mojave Desert heat had already pushed past 104 degrees by mid-morning, baking the cracked asphalt outside Pahrump, Nevada, into something that shimmered at the edges. The kind of heat that makes the air feel thick, like it's pressing down on you. Inside Daniel Reeves's detached garage, a single box fan pushed warm air in slow circles, doing almost nothing against the temperature. Daniel, 34, was a freelance auto mechanic who operated out of that same garage. Engine parts stacked along one wall, tools hanging from pegboard, and tucked against the far end, row of modified enclosures he'd built himself from stacked glass tanks and wooden framing. He was the kind of man who preferred animals to most people, methodical in his routines and quietly proud of the systems he'd built. Nevada was one of the least restrictive states in the country when it came to exotic animal ownership. No formal inspection requirements, no permit process for large constrictors, and a private breeder culture that operated largely without oversight. In Nye County, where Pahrump sits, enforcement only happened when someone complained. Nobody had complained about Daniel. His largest animal was a Burmese python, approximately 15 feet long and weighing over 120 pounds. Burmese pythons are one of the largest snake species on Earth, capable of reaching 18 feet and 200 pounds in adulthood. They are not venomous. They don't need to be. Constriction works by exploiting the breathing cycle. Each time the prey exhales, the coils tighten incrementally, reducing the space available for the next inhale. A snake of this size can exert enough pressure to prevent the human chest wall from expanding at all. Death follows not from crushing, but from the inability to breathe. That distinction matters because it means the process is not fast. I think about that more than I'd like to. Daniel followed a fixed schedule for feeding and enclosure maintenance, and he handled the snake alone every single time, without restraint tools or a second person present. Care guidelines for snakes exceeding 10 feet are explicit. At minimum, 2 handlers should be present during any direct contact. A previous acquaintance had watched Daniel work with the animal on more than one occasion and quietly stopped coming around afterward. That detail sticks with me. Someone saw enough to walk away, and nothing changed. What made the morning of August 17th particularly significant was timing. The python was approaching the end of its feeding window, a period when feeding response behavior is measurably heightened. The animal's tongue would have been working the air constantly, picking up heat signatures and chemical traces from everything in the enclosure and beyond it. At that stage, proximity and warmth register as a single signal. The snake wasn't aggressive by nature, but biology doesn't negotiate. Daniel opened the enclosure fully to remove substrate and water containers, the same way he had done dozens of times before. The routine was so familiar that it had probably stopped feeling like a risk at all. That's the part that unsettles me most. Not recklessness, but repetition. The way familiarity quietly erodes caution until the two are indistinguishable. The python struck at close range and began constriction almost immediately, forming coils around Daniel's upper torso and neck before he could create distance. Additional loops tightened across his chest and arms, compressing the ribcage with the slow, mechanical force that makes Burmese pythons so uniquely dangerous. A heat lamp and plastic basin had been displaced inside the enclosure, evidence of a struggle that was confined and prolonged in a space that offered no room to maneuver. A nearby resident reported a single heavy impact from the direction of the garage. No further sounds followed. Daniel was found that afternoon after he missed scheduled work. The python was still partially coiled around his body when authorities arrived. Removal required control equipment and multiple responders. Death was ruled accidental, constriction during improper solo handling. The remaining reptiles on the property were seized, and the incident prompted a local review of exotic animal safety practices. By then, the only person those guidelines might have protected was already gone. I've thought about this one more than most. Daniel wasn't careless in the way people imagine when they picture these incidents. He was experienced, he was consistent, and he genuinely cared for his animals. But experience without precaution is its own kind of vulnerability. And in a garage in the Nevada desert, that distinction cost him everything. It was February 11th, 2016. The morning arrived the way Philippine mornings do in the dry season. Bright early, the air still carrying a trace of overnight cool before the heat established itself fully. In the residential outskirts where smaller lots bordered agricultural land, the distances between neighbors were close enough that daily routines became shared knowledge. People knew each other's schedules. They knew each other's animals. Rodrigo Aquino was 58 years old. He had spent his adult life as a small-scale fish trader, working the supply chain between local fishing boats and the wet markets along Davao's outskirts. He was known in his neighborhood as a practical man, someone whose word held, who applied steady consistency to everything he was responsible for. The crocodile fit that pattern and had simply grown over 9 years into something that required a different quality of consistency than he had ever been trained to provide. He had kept a saltwater crocodile on his property for 9 years, acquired as a juvenile through the informal wildlife network that operates across the Philippine archipelago, raised in a concrete enclosure along the back edge of his lot. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptilian species on Earth. Males can exceed 6 meters and 1,000 kilograms. Their bite force is the strongest of any animal alive today, and the death roll, the rotational behavior used once contact is established, anchors the bite and spins the body along its longitudinal axis with enough force to incapacitate and dismember, something that cannot be interrupted from outside a fence by a person without specialized equipment, unregistered, unknown to any authority, but known to everyone on his street. Over those 9 years, the crocodile had grown from a juvenile that Rodrigo could manage with relative confidence into an animal whose physical capacity had long since outpaced anything his enclosure was genuinely designed to contain against. The concrete walls had been built for a different animal, smaller, newer, less established in its environment. What Rodrigo had done, incrementally, and without any single decision that felt significant, was continue a routine that the animal had grown into, rather than one that had grown with it. On the morning of February 11th, 6 neighbors were present, 3 passing on their way to work, 2 whose lots adjoined Rodrigo's, and a child who had wandered over from 2 houses down. None of them were inside the enclosure. None had any means of intervention that would have mattered. Rodrigo entered the enclosure with the morning feed. What happened next was not preceded by warning signs the gathered neighbors reported recognizing. What crocodilian researchers document across captive owner incidents is that the behavioral signature of an impending attack is often invisible to untrained observers, because the attack is not a response to threat. It is an opportunistic event, triggered by proximity and movement and the accumulated feeding association of 9 years, executed with the economy of an animal that has not changed its approach to prey in millions of years. 2 of them ran for help. 1 tried to find something to throw. The child stood at the fence and did not move, for reasons that nobody who has ever been frozen by shock needs explained to them. What the witnesses had to sit with afterward was not just what they had seen, but the specific texture of having been close enough to see it clearly, and far enough to be entirely useless. They had watched this feeding before, most of them many times, and nothing in those prior mornings had given them a vocabulary for what they experienced on this one. The neighborhood's long familiarity with the crocodile had not prepared anyone for the reality of the animal at full engagement. It had done the opposite. Rodrigo Aquino died in his enclosure on a bright February morning with 6 people watching who could not reach him. 9 years of routine that had become so familiar it had stopped carrying the weight of what it actually was. And a morning that looked identical to every other morning until the moment it didn't. It was November 19th, 2018, and the concrete compound outside Culiacan glared under harsh floodlights, a stage for 3 years of abuse and neglect about to erupt. The 200-pound jaguar pacing behind the barriers had become far more than a trophy. It was a weapon of pure, concentrated aggression. Ronaldo Ibarra had never been important enough for headlines. At 38, he moved drugs between rural production sites and urban distribution points, wealthy enough to own 5 acres and a custom-built animal pen, but anonymous enough to operate in the vast middle layer of Sinaloa's trafficking networks. Naldo had purchased Ray as a cub from a Chiapas wildlife trafficker in 2015, wanting a distinctly Mexican symbol of power. Unlike other narcos with lions or tigers, he chose a jaguar, but he felt no affection for the animal. Ray lived in a 15 by 15 foot concrete pen with a drain and chain link gate, fed irregularly, and tormented during parties when Naldo would poke him with broomsticks, throw firecrackers nearby, or spray him with hoses. It's hard not to feel a mix of anger and disbelief thinking about this. The animal wasn't a pet. It was just a tool for showing off, completely denied any chance at a normal life. The backyard stretched behind the main house like a concrete stage, dominated by the double-fenced enclosure that had become Ray's prison. Jaguars are the third largest cat species on Earth, adult males reaching 200 pounds with bite forces exceeding 1,500 pounds per square inch, evolved specifically to crush turtle shells and caiman skulls. Their jaws and canines are designed to penetrate bone, not just suffocate prey, making them uniquely lethal. By late 2018, the warning signs were impossible to ignore. Ray had grown aggressive, lunging at the gate and leaving dents in the chain link. During a party earlier that year, the jaguar bit off a drunk associate's fingertip when he reached through the outer barrier, but Naldo laughed it off. Worker Ephraim, tasked with feeding Ray, had developed a system of sliding food under the gate and running, aware of the animal's conditioned aggression toward humans. That night, an argument with his associate Cortez escalated. Drunk and enraged, Naldo dragged Cortez toward Ray's pen, intending to use the jaguar as intimidation. He unlocked the outer gate, pressing Cortez against the inner chain link. What he failed to notice was that the inner gate had not been properly padlocked after the last feeding. The moment the unlatched gate swung open, Ray launched through it. Years of abuse and torment had wired the jaguar to associate Naldo with pain. With 200 pounds of compact muscular force, Ray struck Naldo in the chest, pinning him to the concrete. His claws punctured through clothing into muscle, anchoring him as the jaguar delivered a skull-crushing bite. The sound of cranial bone breaking echoed across the compound. Naldo convulsed violently before going completely limp as Ray's bite penetrated the cranial vault, destroying brain tissue and causing instantaneous death. Reading this, I can't help but feel how quickly the tables turned. Years of cruelty built up into a single moment of devastating, unstoppable force. It's a brutal reminder that wild animals can never truly be owned or controlled. Even after Naldo was dead, Ray continued in overkill behavior, biting repeatedly into the face, throat, and chest. The four associates fled immediately, and Cortez scrambled to safety. Worker Ephraim called police, but officers arrived slowly, reluctant to respond to a narco compound. Ray was eventually tranquilized and removed, then euthanized the following day due to psychological damage and aggression. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as massive cranial trauma and brain destruction from jaguar attack. Local media ran brief reports about exotic animal dangers, but Naldo's criminal background meant minimal investigation. The property was abandoned within weeks, and the concrete pen was demolished months later, leaving only a stained pad as a silent reminder of what had happened. Seeing this, it's hard not to think how preventable it could have been. Rules about keeping dangerous exotic animals, or even just common sense about their strength and instincts, might have saved him. But Naldo ignored every warning and treated a predator like a pet, and the result was exactly what anyone who understands jaguar behavior would expect. It was a brutal mix of human arrogance and lack of caution that ended in total devastation. I want to hear from you. What do you think about these cases? Do you think stricter rules could prevent this? Or is it just human error? Also, how often do you think I should upload videos like this? Let me know in the comments. I'm really curious to see your thoughts. It was July 19, 2017, when the humid Tampa afternoon air drifted through the open windows of Aisha Patel's studio apartment. The modest space was a chaotic mix of camera equipment, ring lights, and elaborate backgrounds for photo shoots. Aisha, 28, had been building her social media presence for 3 years, documenting her life with her fur baby, a 6-year-old male capuchin monkey named Milo. Aisha worked part-time as a beauty consultant at a department store, but her real income came from her growing Instagram following, nearly 80,000 followers who tuned in daily to watch Milo's antics. She dressed him in tiny outfits, filmed him helping with makeup tutorials, and created elaborate scenarios that generated thousands of likes and comments. Her bio proclaimed her Milo's mom, and she frequently referred to the monkey as her son. She had purchased Milo 5 years earlier from an exotic pet dealer at a reptile expo, drawn in by the adorable infant monkey clinging to a stuffed bear. The dealer had assured her that Capuchins were easy pets, neglecting to mention the challenges that come with keeping a wild animal. For the first 2 years, Milo was manageable, cute, curious, and photogenic, but as he matured, his behavior became increasingly difficult. Capuchins are highly intelligent and strong for their size, with adult males weighing between 6 and 9 pounds, but possessing bite forces far exceeding what their small stature suggests. Their canine teeth can grow up to 0.7 inches, disproportionately long for their body size. Males are particularly territorial about food and become increasingly aggressive as they reach sexual maturity around age 5. Despite their small size, Capuchin attacks have resulted in severe facial injuries, and in rare cases involving victims with underlying health conditions, have proven fatal. Aisha had a pre-existing heart condition, a congenital mitral valve defect associated since adolescence with documented episodes of ventricular arrhythmia. Her cardiologist had classified her as being at elevated risk for malignant arrhythmia under severe physical or emotional stress. She had never considered that Milo might pose such a threat. By 2017, Milo's behavior had deteriorated significantly. He would shriek when frustrated, throw objects, and had bitten Aisha several times, though she dismissed these incidents as love nips to her followers. Friends had stopped visiting because Milo would scream and lunge at them. Despite the warning signs, Aisha continued to keep Milo for the sake of her online brand. On the afternoon of July 19th, Aisha was editing photos on her laptop while eating a late lunch, a sandwich, and a bag of chips. Milo sat on his designated perch nearby, his eyes fixed on the food. Aisha had learned to never eat near Milo, but she was distracted by an urgent message from a potential sponsor and forgot her own rule. Milo suddenly leaped from his perch onto the table, grabbing at the bag of chips. Aisha instinctively pulled the bag away, and Milo's expression changed instantly. His lips pulled back, revealing his disproportionately large canines, and he released a high-pitched screech. Before Aisha could react, Milo launched himself at her face. His small but powerful hands gripped her hair, and he bit down on her left cheek with shocking force. The canines punctured through skin and muscle, scraping against the cheekbone beneath. Aisha screamed and tried to pull Milo off, but the monkey held on, biting again, this time tearing into the soft tissue just below her ear, opening a ragged wound that bled freely down her neck and soaked into her shirt. The bites themselves were not immediately life-threatening. What the attack did do was trigger something far more dangerous, given Aisha's medical history. The combination of searing pain, the sight of her own blood, and the terror of being mauled flooded her bloodstream with catecholamines, the same adrenaline surge that in a healthy heart causes little more than a racing pulse. But in a heart with her arrhythmia, history represented exactly the kind of electrical destabilization her cardiologist had long warned against. Aisha managed to grab Milo and throw him across the room. She pressed her hand against the wound and tried to reach her phone, but her heart was already losing its rhythm, her rate climbing past 170 and then fracturing into a disorganized pattern, the electrical signals misfiring across her compromised myocardium in exactly the malignant sequence her medical history had flagged. Her legs gave out. She collapsed to the floor, her hand still pressed against her neck. The arrhythmia deteriorated into ventricular fibrillation, her heart no longer pumping in any coordinated sense, simply quivering uselessly. It was her failing heart, not the blood loss, that was killing her now. Within 3 minutes of the attack, Aisha lost consciousness. Shortly after, she suffered cardiac arrest. By the time her downstairs neighbor heard the commotion and called 911, Aisha had been without a pulse for over 6 minutes. Paramedics arrived 11 minutes after the 911 call. They found Aisha unresponsive on the floor, with Milo screaming from the top of the refrigerator. Animal control secured the monkey before treatment could begin. Despite aggressive resuscitation efforts, Aisha could not be revived. Animal control officers tranquilized Milo and transported him to a specialized primate sanctuary. Due to his attack history and aggressive behavior, veterinarians and behavioral specialists recommended euthanasia. Aisha's family agreed, and Milo was humanely euthanized 3 days later. The investigation revealed that Aisha had been keeping Milo illegally. Florida requires a Class 3 wildlife permit for capuchin monkeys, which she had never obtained. Her landlord was also unaware she was housing a primate in the apartment, a violation of her lease agreement. It was March 3rd, 2015, and the western North Carolina mountains were still carrying the last of winter. Bare hardwoods, cold air, with a faint smell of wood smoke. the kind of late afternoon light that fades faster than you expect once it starts going. On a multi-acre wooded property outside Asheville, the enclosures were well built and the routines were established. Harold Finch, 55, had been keeping exotic animals for over a decade, and by most measures, he knew what he was doing. That's what makes his case so difficult to categorize. Harold wasn't a hobbyist operating on instinct. He was a collector with experience, someone who had invested seriously in infrastructure and took the responsibility of ownership genuinely. North Carolina's exotic animal laws had long existed as a patchwork. Some counties permitted private ownership with minimal oversight, and no uniform statewide ban was in place during this period. Harold operated within that framework, legally and with documentation. His Bengal tiger, approximately 500 pounds, housed in a 40 by 60 foot steel enclosure, had been in his care for years without a serious incident. The enclosure was structurally sound. The feeding schedule was consistent. Harold had done most things right. Most things. Bengal tigers are the largest of the tiger subspecies, and they are built around a single evolutionary principle, the ambush. Their muscular structure is optimized for explosive acceleration over short distances. They can cover ground faster than most people can process what they're seeing. More relevant than their speed, though, is their silence. A Bengal tiger, moving with intent, produces almost no sound, no warning vocalization, no displacement of air that registers as a threat. They approach from behind, targeting the back of the neck or the upper spine, and the strike is initiated only when the prey's attention is directed elsewhere. This is not aggression in the way people typically imagine it. It is precision. And the trigger, more often than almost anything else, is a turned back at close range. Harold knew this. He had read it, likely repeated it to others. The one practice that safety guidelines flag consistently for large predator management is this: never lose visual contact with the animal at close range. It sounds almost too simple to be the thing that matters most. Feeding involved distributing approximately 15 pounds of raw meat across multiple points inside the enclosure, a practice meant to encourage natural foraging behavior. Harold had moved through the space, placing portions along the ground, when a piece of meat dropped near the rear section. He turned away from the tiger to retrieve it. That was the moment. Scuff marks in the soil and the position of the dropped meat told investigators exactly what had happened. A silent approach, no warning, immediate contact. The tiger had covered the distance before Harold had fully straightened up. No one heard anything significant. Nearby resident reported a brief, low disturbance, then nothing. Harold was found the following morning by a grounds worker. The tiger was tranquilized and removed by responding authorities. Investigators found no structural failure in the enclosure, no negligence in the setup, no systemic breakdown in the operation. The incident was attributed entirely to a single lapse in visual awareness during close-range feeding, one moment of inattention in a decade of careful work. I find that harder to sit with than the cases involving obvious recklessness. Harold had done so much right, and the animal didn't malfunction or behave abnormally. It did exactly what a Bengal tiger is built to do when a large animal turns its back at close range. There's no villain in this story, just a predator acting on instinct, and a man who looked away at the wrong second. It was November 3rd, 2018. The Limpopo bushveld had entered its early wet season, the grass coming up green after the dry months, the mornings humid, the heat building through the day, and releasing in late afternoon storms that moved fast across the flat land. On private farms in the region, the size of the properties and the distances between homesteads create a kind of operational independence that those who live there absorb as simply the condition of that life. Peter Van Wyck was 62 years old. He had spent most of his working life as a farm manager across Limpopo and Mpumalanga, meticulous, record-keeping, the kind of man who understood systems and had the patience to maintain them over decades. His daughter Anki, 31, lived in Pretoria and visited when she could, more out of concern for a man living alone than obligation. His farm workers, Joseph, Elias, and a younger man who had been there less than a year, were part of the property's daily structure. Joseph had worked for Peter for nearly a decade, Elias for 6. They knew Luther. Peter had kept a male lion on his property for 11 years, acquired through the captive breeding network that operates extensively in southern Africa, purchased as a cub and raised as a private companion in a large enclosure adjacent to the main farmstead. He called the lion Luther. African lions are the only truly social member of the cat family, and in the wild, a pride male's authority is maintained through constant social signaling. In captivity, that architecture collapses to the single relationship between keeper and animal. and that relationship is asymmetric in a way that never resolves. The signals a lion uses to calibrate where a person stands in its world are body language, scent, and the behavioral confidence that comes from physical authority. Luther had become part of the rhythm of the property, in the same way that any long-standing routine becomes invisible through repetition. The farm workers had organized their mornings around the feeding schedule without consciously deciding to. Anka, on her visits, had come to think of the enclosure as simply a feature of the place, present, contained, managed. 11 years of uneventful history had distributed the weight of the risk across so many ordinary mornings that no single morning felt like it carried very much of it. Luther had grown to over 200 kilograms. Peter had managed him for 11 years through strict routine and daily attentiveness. Fatal captive lion incidents in southern Africa follow a documented pattern. The keeper is almost always experienced, the animal almost always familiar, and the incident almost always occurs when the keeper's reading of the animal's behavioral state is slightly out of alignment with where the animal actually is. 11 years of successful management does not reduce that risk. In some respects, it increases it. Luther had been pacing since early morning. Peter noticed it and attributed it to the weather change. He had fed Luther in a pacing state before, and the animal had always settled when food arrived. That assessment was not unreasonable, given his history. It was also, on that particular morning, wrong, in a way the pacing alone did not make obvious. Peter entered the enclosure. What the farm workers described, and what Anka described from the veranda, was a sequence that lasted less than 30 seconds from entry to irreversible outcome. Luther did not come to the food. Luther came to Peter. The distinction is real between an animal that is hungry and one in a predatory state where hunger and prey drive have merged into something that food alone will not redirect. The signals had been there since early morning, carrying a charge that 11 years of familiarity had made harder, not easier, to read. Joseph ran for the rifle in the equipment shed. Elias stopped at the outer fence. There was nothing he could do there, and he knew it. The third worker was already on the phone. Anki came off the veranda at a run and stopped at the outer gate for the same reason. The inner enclosure was a space nobody was entering while Luther was in it. The rifle reached the fence in time to end what was happening. It did not reach the fence in time to change what had already occurred. Peter Van Wyck died inside the enclosure he had built, 11 years into a relationship with an animal that had given him 11 years of reason to believe he understood it. The investigation documented an unlicensed, unregistered adult male lion, unknown to any regulatory system, maintained by a single person whose death left nobody else on that property with any means of managing it safely. What Anki described afterward, in the account that stayed with me, was the specific experience of watching from the veranda and understanding what was happening before she had words for it. The kind of comprehension that arrives in the body before it arrives in the mind. She had run before she had consciously decided to run, and she had stopped at the gate, not because she didn't want to go further, but because some part of her understood, without being told, that the gate was as far as the situation was going to let her go. It was August 22nd, 2017, and the suffocating heat of coastal Alabama pressed down over Bayou La Batre. The small town's streets were quiet under the late afternoon sun, but behind one unassuming house, a half-acre backyard held a crude pond, seemingly peaceful, yet hiding a lethal predator ready to strike. Devlin Arsenault had always been the guy to take a dare. At 32, he worked as a commercial crab fisherman and part-time mechanic, standing 6 feet 2 inches and 240 pounds, known among friends for never backing down from a challenge. He lived alone in a small house, with minimal family contact, no social media presence, and few responsibilities beyond work and fishing. In 2013, Devlin caught a 3-foot juvenile American alligator in one of his traps and decided to keep it, naming it Diesel. What began as a novelty in a kiddie pool grew into a crude 15-foot pond fed with raw chickens, roadkill, and crab scraps. By 2017, Diesel measured 9 feet and weighed over 300 pounds, a fully grown apex predator. I can't imagine how blind he must have been. thinking he could tame something with instincts this deadly. The pond sat 30 feet from his kitchen window, surrounded by a low chain-link fence that offered little barrier. American alligators have bite forces exceeding 2,900 pounds per square inch and can lunge up to 20 miles per hour over short distances. Their predatory instincts, honed over millions of years, recognize only threats and food, not human owners. Warning signs had multiplied that year, but Devlin ignored them. Diesel had killed 2 of a neighbor's chickens and become increasingly territorial, hissing when approached. Devlin responded with bravado, throwing objects at the alligator to assert dominance, only reinforcing his status as a threat associated with food. Neighbors considered calling authorities, but feared Devlin's temper. That evening, after drinking heavily, Devlin carried a bag of chicken thighs to the pond. He walked barefoot across the dark yard, relying on moonlight and the glow from his kitchen window. Leaning over the water to toss the chicken, he didn't notice Diesel resting in the grass behind him. In an instant, the alligator slammed into the back of his legs with explosive force. Devlin fell backward into the mud, and Diesel's jaws clamped onto his right calf, pulverizing bone with devastating force. The alligator executed its signature death roll, tearing Devlin's lower leg apart. Blood spurted from the femoral artery as he tried to crawl away, only to have Diesel clamp down on his left arm above the elbow. Another roll snapped the humerus and dislocated the joint. Severely wounded, Devlin lay bleeding, one leg gone, one arm destroyed, as Diesel latched onto his torso and dragged him into the pond. Water closed over his face as the alligator held him underwater, applying drowning techniques used on large prey. His body thrashed weakly before going still. Diesel repositioned the body under a submerged log, typical caching behavior before consumption. I can't imagine the horror of being that close to something so instinctively deadly, with no way to survive once it decided you were prey. The pond churned as Diesel thrashed with Devlin's body, sending ripples across the still backyard. Blood and mud filled the air as Devlin's hands clawed at the ground in a desperate, futile attempt to escape. Diesel's jaws and claws tore methodically, each movement precise and deadly. Minutes passed, the struggle subsiding until the water finally stilled, covering what remained of Devlin. The following afternoon, a friend discovered the scene and called authorities. Deputies and wildlife officers arrived promptly, shooting and killing Diesel. The medical examiner listed exsanguination and drowning from alligator attack as the cause of death. Devlin's right leg was recovered, but his left arm was never found. Local news ran brief coverage. No charges were filed, as the violator of Alabama's alligator laws was deceased. His sister handled the property, discovering the crude setup and videos of Devlin feeding Diesel while intoxicated, all of which she deleted. His funeral was small, attended mainly by friends, and the pond was filled in shortly afterward. Looking back, it's impossible not to see how preventable this was. Stricter laws on exotic animal possession and more public awareness could have stopped Diesel from ever becoming a backyard predator. At the same time, Devlin ignored every warning, the territorial hissing, the kills, and his own intoxicated misjudgments. Responsibility feels shared, a deadly combination of human recklessness and regulatory gaps that ended in a horrific, entirely avoidable death. It was June 12, 2014, when the South African sun blazed over the sprawling private compound in the remote Northern Cape province. The 40-acre property sat isolated from the nearest town by miles of dusty roads and acacia-dotted landscape. Marcus Engel, 42, had built his dream here, a private exotic animal collection that included zebras, wildebeest, and his prized possession, a male African lion named Apollo. Marcus had made his fortune in the diamond trade before retiring early to pursue his passion for exotic animals. He purchased the 8-week-old lion cub from a controversial breeding facility 3 years earlier, bottle feeding it and raising it in his home before moving it to a custom-built enclosure on the property. His friends knew him as someone who pushed boundaries, often posting videos of himself playing with Apollo like an oversized house cat. The compound's main attraction was Apollo's 2-acre enclosure, surrounded by 12-foot chain-link fencing, Marcus had designed it himself, including a wooden platform where he would sit during feeding times. He entered the enclosure daily, believing his bond with Apollo transcended the animal's predatory nature. Local exotic animal owners had warned him repeatedly that socialization didn't eliminate instinct, but Marcus dismissed their concerns. On the morning of June 12th, Marcus noticed Apollo limping slightly after the lion had gotten into a brief scuffle with a zebra through the fence line the previous evening. The lion seemed agitated, pacing with his tail twitching, a sign Marcus failed to recognize as stress behavior. Despite this, Marcus decided to proceed with the afternoon feeding session, carrying a 30-pound haunch of beef into the enclosure. Adult male African lions weigh between 330 and 550 pounds, with massive shoulder muscles capable of taking down prey 5 times their size. Their canine teeth can reach 3 inches in length, designed to pierce through thick hide and crush windpipes. Lions can sprint at speeds up to 50 miles per hour in short bursts, and their bite force exceeds 650 pounds per square inch, strong enough to crack bone with a single clamp. Even lions raised in captivity retain their predatory instincts, which can activate instantly when the animal is injured, stressed, or perceives a threat during feeding. Marcus entered the enclosure through the double gate system, locking the outer gate behind him. Apollo watched from the far corner, his amber eyes tracking every movement. As Marcus approached the feeding platform, he made the fatal decision to examine Apollo's injured paw, setting the meat down and reaching toward the lion's leg. The attack came with explosive violence. Apollo's lips curled back before he lunged forward. The 450-pound lion closed the 15-foot distance in less than 2 seconds. Marcus had no time to react. Before the lion's front paws struck his chest and shoulders, each blow carrying over 400 pounds of force that instantly fractured his ribs and sternum. The impact knocked Marcus backward onto the hard-packed earth. Apollo's claws raked across his torso before the lion delivered his killing bite, clamping his massive jaws around Marcus's neck and shoulder. The canines penetrated deep, severing the carotid artery on the right side and puncturing the subclavian artery on the left. Apollo maintained his grip for approximately 20 seconds, crushing Marcus's trachea and cervical vertebrae, then began dragging Marcus toward the corner of the enclosure, instinctive behavior for securing a kill. Marcus's body went into immediate shock from the catastrophic blood loss. Within 90 seconds, his blood pressure dropped to critical levels. The combination of severed major arteries and a crushed airway proved fatal within 3 minutes. Apollo released Marcus's body and returned to the feeding platform, typical lion behavior once the perceived threat is neutralized. Marcus's property manager discovered the scene 2 hours later. Local wildlife authorities arrived and euthanized Apollo to safely recover the body. An investigation revealed that Marcus had no proper permits for housing a dangerous exotic animal, and his enclosure failed to meet even basic safety standards. The property was shut down, and the remaining animals were seized and relocated to accredited sanctuaries. It was September 22, 2017, and a low overcast had settled over the outskirts of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the kind of gray midday sky that makes everything feel slightly muted. The temperature was mild, unremarkable, the sort of weather that doesn't stay in your memory. What happened inside a modified garage on a quiet suburban street that afternoon, however, is not the kind of thing that leaves easily. Melissa Grant, 29, lived alone in a home she had gradually adapted around the needs of her most unusual resident. She worked remotely, kept to herself, and by most accounts was thoughtful and organized. Someone who had researched primate care extensively before acquiring the animal and continued reading long after. She had obtained the chimpanzee years earlier, before Oklahoma began tightening its primate ownership laws following a series of high-profile incidents across the country. Under the older framework, private ownership existed in a regulatory gap that was wide enough to drive through without much friction. Melissa had done everything that was technically required of her at the time. That's part of what makes this so hard to categorize. The chimpanzee she kept was an adult male, weighing approximately 140 pounds. That number sounds manageable until you understand what it means in practice. Chimpanzees are not exotic pets in the way people sometimes imagine. Curious, trainable, manageable, with the right approach. Their upper body musculature is dense and fast twitch in ways that human anatomy simply isn't. Specialists in primate behavior are consistent and unambiguous. Private ownership of adult chimpanzees is not a question of whether a serious incident will occur, but when. The animal had already been showing signs of escalating territorial behavior, bending fixtures inside the enclosure, displacing objects during cleaning. Melissa had noted these changes. She hadn't altered her approach. I think she probably told herself she knew him well enough. That's a very human thing to believe, and it's almost never true with an animal like this. On the morning of September 22nd, she entered the enclosure for midday cleaning, removing food containers and replacing them with fresh supplies. It was a task she had performed hundreds of times. The attack began as items were being removed, a pattern consistent with territorial or possession-triggered responses documented in chimpanzee behavior research. Once initiated, the escalation was rapid. Impact marks on the interior walls and overturned containers indicated the violence of what unfolded in that confined space. A chimpanzee of that size, in a territorial state, in an enclosed room, there was no realistic path to escape. A neighbor reported several loud impacts from inside the structure, then silence. Authorities conducted a welfare check after failed contact attempts. The animal was sedated before anyone entered. Melissa was found inside the enclosure. Death was ruled accidental due to traumatic injuries. Local authorities informally tightened restrictions on primate ownership in the area following the incident, though formal legislation remained limited. I've read a lot about chimpanzee incidents in the course of putting these stories together, and the one thing that strikes me every time is how the warning signs are almost always present and almost always misread. Not ignored exactly, misread. Melissa saw the changes in the animal's behavior. She interpreted them as manageable. That gap between observation and action is where these tragedies tend to live. It was March 15th, 2015. Broward County, Florida, sat under the kind of late winter warmth that the rest of the country hadn't reached yet. Humid, close, the kind of evening that gathers inside a house full of people and makes the air feel thicker than it should. Derek Holloway had hosted gatherings at his place before. He was known in his circle for the python, had been for years. Derek was 34 years old. He worked as an HVAC technician out of Fort Lauderdale. Reliable, the kind of person who remembered people's names and showed up early without being asked. Outside of work, he was social, liked having his space filled, liked being the reason people gathered. What he knew about Burmese pythons, he had learned through years of dedicated reading and hands-on experience. The kind of self-education that covers most of the ground, but sometimes misses the edge cases until they arrive. He had kept the Burmese python since it was a juvenile, acquired through private channels, raised in an enclosure he had built in a back room, fed on a schedule that had become as routine as any other part of his week. Burmese pythons are one of the largest snake species on Earth, capable of exceeding 6 meters and 90 kilograms. They possess heat-sensing pits along the jaw that detect infrared radiation from warm-blooded animals with a precision that doesn't require sight or smell. In a warm, crowded room, every person present is radiating exactly the kind of thermal signature those pits are built to find. The snake was several meters in length by the time of the incident. There were 7 people in the room when Derek brought the python out. The house was warm. The snake had been in that warmth all evening, its thermal sensitivity responding to an environment saturated with biological signals. Derek had fed it 2 days prior, close enough that the feeding response had not fully reset, far enough that the timing felt unremarkable. He had done this before, without incident. When something goes smoothly 20 times, the 21st doesn't feel different until it is. He draped the snake across his shoulders, the way he always had. What happened next unfolded in seconds. The python struck at Derek, at the warmth of his body, at the thermal signature of the person holding it in an environment the animal system had been processing for hours. Coils followed with the mechanical inevitability that large constrictor attacks always carry. Not frenzied, not loud, methodical. Constriction works not through suffocation, but cardiovascular arrest. The pressure a large Burmese python exerts is sufficient to prevent the heart from maintaining circulation long before the lungs stop working. The room had 7 people in it. 7 people who were present, who could see what was happening, who wanted to help. 2 grabbed at the coils immediately. The problem was everything around it. The shock, the lack of coordination, the complete absence of anything in that living room designed to interrupt a large constrictor mid-coil. No cutting tool within reach. No one trained in the specific technique, applying pressure behind the jaw, uncoiling from the tail end, that offers the best chance of interruption. They pulled. They repositioned. Someone called 911. Another ran for the kitchen and came back with nothing that worked. None of it came together in time. The cardiovascular compression that large constrictors produce does not pause for people to find their footing. By the time first responders arrived, the window that might have made a difference had already closed. What the witnesses described in the aftermath was not the chaos people might imagine. It was a specific, grinding helplessness. The experience of watching something catastrophic happen in slow motion, while everything you try falls short by a margin you can feel but can't close. Several of them had interacted with the snake before that evening, had held it, had thought of it as part of what made Derek's place interesting. The investigation documented it clearly. A privately kept exotic constrictor, a warm, crowded environment, a feeding window that had not fully closed, and a handling decision made without the awareness that anything was different about that evening. Nothing about the animal's behavior leading up to the moment had registered as unusual to anyone in the room. That is the specific cruelty of thermal-triggered feeding responses in large constrictors. They do not build visibly. They do not announce themselves. They resolve in the span of time it takes for a room full of people to realize they are not watching a show. Derek Holloway died in his living room with 7 people watching. It wasn't. That's the part that stays with me. Nothing was different until it was. It was June 14th, 2015. The humid Oklahoma evening hung over the rural outskirts of Tulsa, where a 2-acre property sat isolated, far from the nearest road, surrounded by oak trees and buzzing cicadas. Caspian Delvaux had always been invisible. At 24, he lived alone on inherited land, spending evenings watching exotic animal videos and dreaming of a companion. Co-workers called him quiet and awkward, and he had no close friends or social media presence, known mostly at the local feed store where he bought large amounts of raw meat. In early 2013, Caspian found an online advertisement from an unlicensed breeder selling rare African, wild dog hybrids. He wired the money immediately. What he picked up locally from the seller was a 10-week-old spotted hyena cub, which Caspian, unaware of the difference, named Bronco. Looking back, it is hard not to feel a mix of disbelief and sadness. Anyone could have been fooled in his place. Over the next 2 years, he raised what he believed was an exotic dog breed, applying online dog training techniques that failed spectacularly, but seemed manageable, while the animal remained small. I can almost picture him thinking, "This is fine. It is just a big dog," completely unaware of the danger growing right in his backyard. The backyard enclosure stretched across a 1/4 acre, surrounded by chain-link fencing. It had seemed adequate when Bronco weighed 20 pounds. Spotted hyenas are efficient predators with bone-crushing jaws capable of over 1,100 pounds per square inch of bite force. Adult females weigh about 140 pounds, males slightly less, with a compact, muscular build designed for dismantling carcasses on the savanna. By 2015, the warning signs were impossible to ignore. Delivery drivers avoided the property after seeing Bronco pacing, and neighbors reported strange whooping and cackling. But Caspian dismissed it, insisting Bronco was just an African Basenji mix. The hyena had killed a stray cat the previous fall, leaving only crushed bones. Yet Caspian rationalized it as protective behavior and began wearing thick gloves when feeding the increasingly aggressive animal. That Sunday evening, he brought a whole raw chicken into the enclosure, wearing shorts and a t-shirt, forgetting to latch the gate. Bronco waited in the far corner, watching with the calculating patience of an apex predator. Caspian called out in the baby voice he always used, reaching into the bag to retrieve the chicken. Instead of approaching for food, Bronco lowered his head, hackles rising, and moved forward in a tense, direct approach. Caspian froze as 140 pounds of muscle suddenly surged across the enclosure. The impact knocked him flat onto his back, the chicken flying from his hands as Bronco's full weight crashed into his chest. Before he could scream, the hyena's jaws clamped down on his right forearm with bone-crushing force. The radius and ulna snapped audibly, and Caspian's shriek echoed across the empty property. He tried to roll away, kicking desperately, but Bronco released the mangled arm and lunged for his midsection. The hyena's teeth tore through Caspian's t-shirt and into soft tissue, ripping into his lower abdomen. Crawling toward the unlatched gate, he managed only a few feet before Bronco crushed his right thigh. He collapsed face down as the hyena continued biting into his legs and midsection, his screams turning into gurgling sounds as shock set in within minutes. His heart rate skyrocketed while blood pressure plummeted, vision tunneling as catastrophic blood loss overwhelmed his system. The last sound he likely processed was Bronco's high-pitched giggling, the excited vocalization hyenas make when feeding. Death came from massive abdominal trauma and exosanguination as Bronco consumed portions of his abdominal cavity and inner thighs, continuing to feed intermittently throughout the night. A co-worker sent for a welfare check discovered the scene and immediately called authorities. Law enforcement and animal control responded promptly. The coroner listed the cause of death as massive hemorrhaging and abdominal trauma from a large predator. Caspian's remains were unrecognizable, and the local wildlife department confirmed Bronco was a spotted hyena, not a dog. The unlicensed breeder had previously been shut down. Caspian's death was ruled accidental, and Bronco was euthanized. This tragedy makes me question how preventable it really was. Stricter rules on exotic animal sales and more public awareness might have stopped Caspian from bringing a predator into his backyard. At the same time, he ignored warning signs, the pacing, the growling, the attack on a stray cat, and failed to secure the enclosure. To me, responsibility feels shared, a mix of human error and regulatory gaps that led to such a horrific outcome. It was March 4th, 2016, when the desert heat shimmered over Daniel Ortiz's property in rural Arizona, just outside Tucson. The 5-acre compound featured several large outbuildings, housing Daniel's extensive reptile collection, everything from rattlesnakes to monitor lizards. But the crown jewel was a 10-year-old Komodo dragon named Titan, housed in a custom-built habitat that took up half of the largest building on the property. Daniel, 38, was a self-taught herpetologist who had spent 15 years building his reputation in the exotic reptile community. He ran a small but successful breeding operation, selling high-end reptiles to private collectors and occasionally consulting for small zoos. His expertise was widely respected, but those who knew him also knew he had a dangerous habit. He took unnecessary risks to save time during routine maintenance. Daniel had acquired Titan 8 years earlier through a complex process involving federal exotic animal permits, sites clearance, and a transfer arrangement with a licensed zoological facility in Florida. Titan was just 2 feet long at the time, but had since grown to 8 feet and weighed approximately 180 pounds. Daniel hand-fed Titan weekly and had developed what he believed was a mutual respect with the massive lizard. The habitat was a 30 by 20 foot enclosure with concrete floors, heated rocks, and a shallow pool. Every 2 weeks, Daniel entered to deep clean, while Titan was fed in a separate holding area. However, Daniel had recently started taking shortcuts, cleaning while Titan was still in the main habitat to save the 30 minutes it took to move the dragon. On the afternoon of March 4th, Daniel began his routine cleaning. Titan rested near the heated rocks, seemingly uninterested in Daniel's activities. About 20 minutes in, Daniel reached to adjust a heat lamp and accidentally sliced his left hand on a sharp edge of the metal fixture. The cut was minor, maybe an inch long across his palm, but it bled freely. Daniel cursed under his breath and reached for a rag, not immediately noticing that Titan's head had lifted and his forked tongue was flicking rapidly in the air. Komodo dragons are the world's largest living lizards. Adult males can exceed 10 feet in length and weigh over 200 pounds, with powerful jaws bearing between 50 and 60 serrated teeth designed to tear flesh. They possess venom glands in their lower jaw that secrete anticoagulant and hypotensive compounds, substances that impair clotting and contribute to shock, compounding the already severe mechanical trauma of a bite. Highly sensitive to scent, Komodo dragons can detect blood from considerable distances using their Jacobson's organ, and fresh blood triggers their predatory response with near immediacy. Titan slowly raised his massive body from the heated rock, eyes locking onto Daniel's bleeding hand. Daniel noticed and began backing toward the enclosure door, maintaining eye contact and speaking in what he hoped was a calm tone. But Titan was already committed. The 180-pound lizard moved with surprising speed, closing the 12 feet between them in less than 3 seconds. Daniel turned to run, but his foot caught on the drain grate, and he stumbled. Titan's jaws clamped down on Daniel's left forearm, just above the wrist. The serrated teeth drove deep into muscle and tendon, and the dragon's neck muscles thrashed side to side in the signature killing motion that tears massive chunks of flesh from prey. Multiple blood vessels were torn open simultaneously, including both the radial and ulnar arteries, producing hemorrhage that could not be controlled by pressure alone. The venom compounds would further impair clotting over the following minutes, but it was the sheer physical destruction of the bite that made the wound immediately life-threatening. Even as Daniel pressed his right hand hard against the torn flesh, blood surged through his fingers in steady, unstoppable pulses. Titan released his grip after approximately 15 seconds and stepped back. Functioning on pure adrenaline, Daniel scrambled toward the exit and got through the door, slamming it shut behind him. He stumbled toward his truck, pressing his right hand against the wound with as much force as he could manage. The pressure slowed the bleeding, but could not stop it. Without a tourniquet, the damage to multiple vessels was simply too extensive. Daniel collapsed next to his truck and managed to dial 911, gasping out his address before the phone slipped from his fingers. He lost consciousness approximately 8 minutes after the initial bite. Without a tourniquet in place, the hemorrhage continued unchecked. Emergency responders arrived 17 minutes after the 911 call and found Daniel unconscious in a large pool of blood. Paramedics applied a tourniquet and initiated IV fluids, but Daniel had already lost a dangerous proportion of his blood volume. He was airlifted to a trauma center in Tucson, where surgeons worked to repair the extensive vascular damage. The surgery stabilized him temporarily, but the hemorrhagic shock had taken a severe toll. His organs began to fail despite transfusions and interventions. Daniel never regained consciousness and died 18 hours after the attack from multi-organ failure. Wildlife authorities seized Titan and Daniel's entire reptile collection. The Komodo dragon was quarantined before being transferred back to the zoological facility that had originally provided him. Arizona tightened its regulations on dangerous exotic species in the aftermath. It was May 14th, 2013, and by mid-morning, the air in the Kochi outskirts was already thick and wet. Somewhere inside a single-story home on the edge of a quiet residential lane, a man was preparing to do something his neighbors had watched him do a dozen times before. Rajesh Menon, 42, had spent the better part of 2 decades working with snakes. He sourced them, bred them, and sold them to private collectors and the occasional research contact. He was not formally trained, no herpetology degree, no institutional affiliation, but he had handled enough animals to carry himself with the confidence of someone who believed experience was indistinguishable from expertise. I do think overconfidence is a slow and insidious killer, and this man will prove it. He was well known on his lane, the kind of man who attracted small crowds when he opened the terrariums in his back room. Neighbors recalled him as loud and good-humored, someone who liked an audience. His prized possession was a king cobra he had kept for roughly 3 years, nearly 12 feet long, which he referred to by a nickname and claimed had never given him serious trouble. He had told people this often enough that he had begun to believe it, absolutely. The lane where Rajesh lived ran alongside a narrow canal choked with water hyacinth, and on the morning of the 14th, the air smelled of mud and something faintly floral. He had invited 2 neighbors over, a retired schoolteacher and the man who ran a small provision shop nearby, to see the cobra before a potential buyer came to look at it that afternoon. King cobras are the longest venomous snakes on Earth, capable of reaching over 18 feet and weighing more than 20 pounds. A single envenomation can deliver a large volume of venom, sometimes several hundred milligrams depending on the bite, capable of causing rapid and severe neurotoxic effects in humans. The schoolteacher later told investigators that Rajesh had said the snake was used to his presence, that it would not react. He lifted the lid and reached in barehanded, gripping the animal just behind the jaw as he had done before. For a moment, the cobra was still, then it coiled. The neighbors both stepped back. The strike happened twice, in fast succession, before either man fully registered the first. The cobra's fangs connected near Rajesh's right forearm and again closer to the wrist. He did not drop the snake immediately. He stood holding it for several seconds, his expression difficult to read, before he set it back into the terrarium and closed the lid. The neighbor said he was calm at first. He sat down on the veranda steps, flexing his hand, saying it was fine. I have relatives like this. People who think being flustered and panicking damaged their ego, but none of them ended up this badly. Neither of the witnesses attempted any first aid, and there was a brief period of hesitation as they tried to decide what to do. Rajesh just waved them off and put back the Cobra like nothing happened. He then invited them inside their house for chit-chat. Within 10 minutes, his speech had begun to thicken. By the 20-minute mark, his words were no longer fully intelligible. His eyelids had begun to droop, and his grip strength was visibly weakening, and he was having difficulty controlling his head. The schoolteacher described him leaning against the veranda post, trying to stand, then sliding sideways. His breathing was audible, slow, labored, with long pauses between inhales that grew progressively longer. There was no thrashing, no seizure. The deterioration was quiet and steady in a way both witnesses found more disturbing than violence would have been. His lips were darkening. The venom was dismantling his respiratory musculature with mechanical precision. The teacher called the local government hospital at approximately the 20-minute mark. The ambulance arrived about 30 minutes after that call. By then, Rajesh was supine on the veranda floor, unresponsive, showing progressive paralysis, still breathing weakly in shallow, irregular pulls. Paramedics attempted resuscitation. He was transported but showed no meaningful response during transit and was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. The Cobra was found inside the closed terrarium when wildlife officers arrived later that afternoon. The post-mortem examination confirmed full neurotoxic envenomation. The report noted bilateral fang punctures on the right forearm consistent with a defensive strike pattern, significant venom absorption, and complete respiratory paralysis as the cause of death. Rajesh's family cremated him within 2 days. I can't help but think this was a death entirely of his own making. A man so drunk on his own hype, so desperate to play the fearless expert for a pair of captive neighbors, that he barehanded a 12-foot neurotoxic missile and then waved off help like he'd stubbed a toe. It was June 9, 2016, and the South Texas heat had settled over the scrubland outside Laredo like a weight that didn't lift, even as the afternoon stretched toward evening. The sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of day where shadows go flat and the air smells faintly of dust and dry grass. On a rural property set back from the main road, a chain-link enclosure sat behind a low outbuilding, its wooden support posts weathered from years of sun exposure. Victor Salinas, 42, had operated an unaccredited roadside animal exhibit on that property for several years. He wasn't a trained zoologist or a licensed facility operator. He was someone who had built something unconventional and kept building it, driven by a genuine fascination with animals that most people only ever see behind institutional glass. Texas law required registration with local authorities and liability insurance for dangerous wild animals, but enforcement varied heavily by county, and in the rural stretch outside Laredo, the paperwork existed somewhere between informal and non-existent. I don't say that to excuse what followed, but I think it matters for understanding how someone ends up in a situation like this. Passion and proximity are a combination that requires structure to be safe, and structure was something Victor's operation consistently lacked. The centerpiece of the property was an adult male African lion, weighing approximately 420 pounds. African lions are apex predators, built for explosive short-distance pursuit. They can accelerate to 50 miles per hour in seconds, and are capable of delivering a bite force exceeding 650 pounds per square inch, enough to crush bone without effort. What most people don't know is that lions are highly attuned to feeding schedules. In captivity, irregular timing doesn't make them calmer. It makes them more reactive, more alert to the moment food arrives, and more likely to respond to entry as a feeding trigger rather than a routine interaction. Victor's feeding times were inconsistent, sometimes delayed by hours. That inconsistency in an animal of this size and temperament was not a minor detail. No secondary containment barriers had been installed. Neighbors had raised concerns more than once about the fencing and the practice of entering the enclosure during feeding rather than using an external delivery system. Standard safety practices for large predator management are unambiguous on this point. Shared space feeding is not a procedure, it's a gamble. Victor had taken that gamble many times. On June 9th, the odds caught up. The afternoon had already run long. Feeding was delayed past its usual window, and Victor entered the enclosure carrying exposed raw meat, the same way he had done countless times before. I keep coming back to that phrase, the same way he had done countless times before. It appears in almost every one of these cases, and every time it means the same thing. The routine had become the risk. The lion advanced the moment Victor stepped through the gate, closing the distance before the food could be placed. The response was immediate and consistent with a feeding-triggered reaction in a large predator that had been waiting past its expected mealtime. Disturbed ground and drag marks near the entry point told the story of what followed. The attack happened fast, within a short distance of where Victor had entered, leaving almost no time between the gate closing and the moment everything changed. Nearby residents reported a brief animal disturbance, then silence. Victor was found later that evening by a family member. The lion was euthanized on site by responding authorities, and the property was shut down immediately. The incident prompted a local review of privately maintained exotic animal enclosures in the region, though the findings were largely informal. There's something about this case that I find particularly difficult to sit with. Victor had been doing this for years. The lion had never seriously injured anyone. And that history, I think, was exactly the problem. Every uneventful feeding made the next one feel safer than it was, until the one that wasn't. It was May 22nd, 2017. The wet season had settled into its rhythm. Dense, saturated air over the river margin. The forest holding water in every surface. The afternoons building toward rain that arrived with the regularity of something scheduled. In the smaller communities along the river roads of Pará State, where houses sit close to the tree line, and the distance between one family's life and another's is measured in sounds through open windows, the ordinary has a texture that is different from anywhere else. Adriano Correa was 43 years old. He was a smallholder farmer growing manioc and maize on a plot cleared from the forest margin over more than a decade, supplemented by seasonal work on larger farms in the region. His wife Sylvia managed the household and ran a small, informal trade in goods that served the immediate neighborhood, sharper and more forward-looking than Adriano, the one who knew what things cost and what they were worth. His daughter Beatrice was 12, already developing her mother's watchfulness, and his son Gabriel was 9 and had his father's temperament, easy, unhurried, slow to alarm. He had raised the jaguar from a cub after it was found, orphaned near the property's edge 6 years earlier. He kept it in a reinforced enclosure at the rear of the property, never reported it, never registered it. Jaguars are the largest cat in the Western Hemisphere, and pound for pound carry the most powerful bite of any large cat, powerful enough to pierce skull or spine directly. Unlike lions or tigers, which kill through suffocation or blood loss, jaguars deliver a single precision bite to the head or neck designed to end the encounter. Immediately, an anatomy built not for sustained aggression, but for finality. Over 6 years, Adriano had developed a daily familiarity with the animal that made a 200-pound apex predator feel, across the distance of enough ordinary mornings, like something manageable. The jaguar had been part of the children's lives for as long as either of them could meaningfully remember. Beatrice had been 6 when it arrived, Gabriel 3, ages at which an animal becomes simply part of the world rather than an addition to it. For them, the enclosure at the back of the property was as ordinary as the manioc plot or the water tank, and the jaguar inside it carried the same quality of background familiarity as anything else that had always been there. On the morning of May 22nd, Sylvia was in the doorway of the enclosure outbuilding, and both children were behind her when Adriano went in to feed. The children watching was not unusual. Nothing in 6 years had given any of them a reason to. Recalibrate that. What none of them had registered was the quality of the jaguar's attention from the moment Adriano entered, a compression of focus, a specific stillness that trained observers distinguish from simple hunger. It was not visible to a family for whom the animal had been a fixture long enough that the signals had stopped carrying individual meaning. The attack came quickly. Adriano went down. Sylvia reached the enclosure gate and could not enter. The animal was between her and her husband, and entering that space without a weapon was not intervention, it was addition. She stood at the gate and kept calling his name, which is what people do when the only thing they have left is sound. Beatrice ran for the nearest neighbor. Gabriel stood in the doorway and did not move. It is what 9-year-old children do when they watch something their brain has no category for. By the time the neighbor arrived and the firearm was retrieved, the outcome had already been determined. Adriano Correa died in the enclosure he had built, with his family present, from an animal he had raised from the first weeks of its life. No registration, no permit, no record of the animal's existence in any official system, and no evidence that any of those absences had ever felt like a gap to the family living around it. What the investigation could not document, because investigations are not built for it, is what Sylvia carried out of that morning beyond the loss itself. The specific weight of having stood at a gate with nothing left to offer, of having called a name into a space she could not enter. That particular shape of helplessness does not resolve. It changes over time into something people learn to carry rather than something they set down. It was March 3rd, 2014. The industrial sprawl east of Houston stretched under a cooling evening sky, where a 1.5-acre lot harbored a secret predator and a tragedy waiting to unfold. Behind a double-wide trailer, a makeshift enclosure held 300 pounds of apex predator that had never belonged in captivity. Serafina Quillen had always been drawn to the impossible. At 29, she worked part-time at a gas station while obsessing over big cats, pouring her limited income into tiger forms, posters, and supplies. She had few friends and spent most of her time alone, her fascination with Bengal tigers intensifying as isolation became routine. In late 2011, Sarah purchased a 12-week-old Bengal tiger cub from a Beaumont breeder for $2,500. She named her Kismet and raised her inside the trailer, constructing a 20 by 30-foot enclosure in the backyard with cattle panels and chicken wire, connected directly to the back door with no safety barriers. Texas's lax exotic animal laws in unincorporated areas required no permits, and she told no one of her increasingly dangerous pets. I can't imagine how comforting it must have felt to believe such a powerful animal could truly be a companion. By early 2014, the warning signs were impossible to ignore. Kismet crouched low, tracked Sarah with dilated pupils, and made short bluff charges, behaviors any tiger expert would recognize as rehearsal predation. In February, she bit Sarah's hand during feeding, breaking 2 bones, but Sarah treated it herself rather than seek attention that would raise questions. That Monday evening, Sarah entered the enclosure alone, wearing yoga pants and a thin hoodie. She stepped toward Kismet, who lay on a platform in the center, eyes locked on her approach. Speaking softly, she reached out, unaware of the dilated pupils, shifting hindquarters, and stiff tail that marked a predator's imminent strike. I can almost picture her thinking everything would be fine, trusting a bond that existed only in her mind. In an instant, Kismet exploded forward. Her forepaws struck Sarah's chest with crushing force, knocking her backward into the cattle panel fence before landing atop her. The tiger's jaws opened wide, revealing 3-inch canines capable of severing arteries, and clamped around Sarah's throat in the species' signature killing bite. Her hands beat helplessly against the massive skull as Kismet adjusted her grip, puncturing both carotid arteries and sending arterial blood across her white chin fur. Sarah's struggles slowed, fingers curling limply as her heart failed, while the tiger held the bite for minutes beyond life. Then, methodically, Kismet began feeding, using claws and teeth to consume the abdomen and internal organs with evolutionary efficiency. Hours passed with Sarah's body exposed to the dirt and enclosure, the tiger acting entirely on instinct. Every movement, every tear of flesh was precise, efficient, and unavoidable. I can't imagine the horror she must have experienced in those final moments, trapped in an animal's world where there was no chance of mercy. A gas station manager became concerned after Sarah missed several shifts. Authorities arrived to discover the scene, the tiger lying calmly beside her scattered remains. Kismet was tranquilized and later euthanized. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as exsanguination from severed carotid arteries and massive trauma consistent with a large predator attack. Investigators documented the inadequate enclosure, cattle panels held with zip ties, chicken wire topping, and a direct door, connection with no safety barriers. Media coverage was brief, a 90-second KHOU segment and a short Houston Chronicle article on exotic animal laws. No charges were filed, as there was no one left to prosecute. Sarah's journal, chronicling 3 years of her obsession with Kismet, was found inside the trailer. Her final entry, dated the day before her death, expressed plans to spend extra time calming the tiger. Her mother handled the cremation quietly, and the trailer remained empty for months. The tiger posters and photos, a silent testament to obsession and misjudgment. Looking back, this could have been stopped. Rules about keeping big cats and just knowing how dangerous they are might have kept Sarah from ever bringing a tiger home, but she ignored all the warning signs. The stalking, the charges, the bite, and thought she had some special bond with it. In the end, it was a mix of her mistakes and the lack of proper rules that made this disaster happen. It was November 2nd, 2018, when the cool autumn evening settled over Gregor Vandermeer's sprawling property in rural Oregon, about 40 miles south of Portland. The converted barn that served as his reptile breeding facility hummed with heat lamps and climate control systems. Gregor, 45, had spent 2 decades building his reputation as one of the premier python breeders in the Pacific Northwest, specializing in reticulated pythons, the longest snake species on Earth. His operation was modest but profitable, selling juvenile pythons to collectors across the country. His pride and joy was a 20-foot female he had raised from a hatchling over 18 years, a snake he called Empress. She was the foundation of his entire breeding program, and he treated her with a reverence that bordered on obsession. Those who knew Gregor described him as meticulous and safety-conscious, except when it came to Empress. He had built her a dedicated room in the barn, 20 by 15 feet, with heated floors and climbing structures. Unlike his other snakes, Empress had free reign of her space. Gregor entered regularly to clean, conduct health checks, and feed her, always alone, dismissing the long-standing rule that giant constrictors should never be handled without a second person present. Fellow breeders had warned him repeatedly. Gregor insisted he knew Empress better than anyone. On the evening of November 2nd, Gregor prepared her weekly meal, a 15-pound thawed rabbit, and carried it into her room using tongs to keep the scent off his hands. Empress was coiled near her basking spot, her body forming loops nearly 18 inches in diameter. Her tongue flicked as she detected the food. Reticulated pythons are the longest snakes in the world, with large females reaching 20 feet or more and weighing between 150 and 200 pounds. They kill by constriction, not by crushing bones, as commonly believed, but by tightening with each exhale of their prey, preventing the lungs from re-expanding. Death typically follows within minutes, from cardiac arrest and asphyxiation combined. Multiple human fatalities from captive specimens are documented in the United States. Gregor placed the rabbit on the floor about 6 feet from Empress's head and stepped back. As he moved toward the door, his boot caught the edge of a water dish he had forgotten to move. He stumbled, and the sudden movement triggered Empress. She lunged, striking his thigh with her head. The impact knocked him off balance. He fell hard onto his side, and before he could scramble upright, her body was already moving around him. The first coil wrapped his chest and right arm, pinning it to his side. He tried to push free with his left arm, but a second coil came around his neck and upper chest. He tried to call out. The pressure on his lungs reduced it to a gasp. A third coil took his waist and legs. Empress tightened with every breath he gave up. His ribs began to fracture under the sustained pressure, first one, then several in rapid succession. At least one punctured his left lung, which collapsed. The coils around his neck compressed his carotid arteries. His vision darkened. His struggles weakened. Within roughly a minute to 90 seconds, he lost consciousness. Death came within minutes, from a combination of asphyxiation and cardiac arrest. He would not have been aware of it. Empress held her constriction for some time after he died, typical behavior, ensuring prey is fully still before releasing. She then began attempting to swallow him head first, working her jaws forward in the slow, methodical way large constrictors do. His shoulders proved too wide to continue. After an extended effort, she gave up and retreated to her basking spot. Gregor's business partner discovered the scene the following morning when Gregor failed to answer their scheduled call. Animal control officers, working with experienced reptile handlers, sedated Empress and removed her safely. The autopsy recorded multiple rib fractures, a collapsed lung, compression injury to the trachea, and cardiac arrest consistent with constriction. Empress was eventually relocated to a specialized reptile conservation facility, operating under protocols requiring multiple handlers for any interaction with large constrictors. The incident renewed debate across the reptile keeping community, and several states tightened ownership requirements in the years that followed. Gregor Vandermeer had known Empress longer than some of his colleagues had kept snakes at all. He had fed her, cleaned her space, monitored her health through 2 decades of seasons. None of it changed what she was or what she did when he fell. It was November 11th, 2013, and the Arizona desert outside Yuma was doing what it rarely gets credit for, being cold. Not the sharp cold of northern winters, but the dry, biting chill that settles into desert air after dark. The kind that catches people off guard because they associate the landscape with heat. The morning had started clear and still, the kind of quiet that makes a property feel more isolated than it actually is. Leonard Pike, 61, was retired, and the compound behind his residence had become the primary project of his later years. He'd spent decades working before stepping back, and the animals, particularly the Bengal tiger he'd acquired several years prior, had given his days structure and purpose. Arizona was, and remains, one of the more permissive states in the country regarding exotic animal ownership. Private big cat ownership was legal with limited oversight, enclosure standards varied widely by county, and the regulatory framework leaned heavily on self-reporting. Leonard had his paperwork in order. He operated within the law as it existed. That's an important detail because it means the failure here wasn't legal, it was structural, and it had been visible for some time. Bengal tigers are not animals that test boundaries occasionally. They test them constantly, methodically, and with a patience that outlasts most owners' attention spans. In captivity, they pace fence lines, probe weak points, and apply pressure to structures repeatedly over time, not out of distress necessarily, but because movement and investigation are hardwired into their behavior. A tiger that has identified a weak point in its enclosure will return to it. Wildlife containment specialists note that ground-level vulnerabilities are among the most common failure points in private enclosures because erosion and soil shift happen gradually and are easy to underestimate until the gap is already significant. The steel holds, the ground beneath it moves, and the animal notices before the owner does. Leonard's enclosure was a 35 by 50-foot steel structure anchored into concrete footings, substantial by most private standards. But along the base of the fence line, soil erosion and minor burrowing had created weak points. Over time, gaps where the ground had shifted away from the steel. Leonard had observed them. Partial repairs had been made. The gaps had not been fully closed. Containment standards for large predators are explicit. Reinforced ground barriers and double gate entry systems are not optional features. They are the difference between a secure enclosure and one that is waiting for the right amount of pressure. I think about how many times Leonard must have walked past those weak points and told himself he'd get to it properly. I've done the same thing with far less consequential problems, and I still feel uneasy about it. On the morning of November 11th, Leonard approached the enclosure carrying approximately 12 pounds of raw meat for the morning feeding. What he didn't know, couldn't have known from the approach path, was that the tiger had already found the weakened section at the base of the fence line. The animal had forced through the gap, widening it, and exited the enclosure before Leonard reached the gate. Tracks in disturbed soil indicated the tiger had moved freely beyond the enclosure perimeter before the attack occurred. The encounter happened outside in open ground within a short distance of the breach point. There was nothing between Leonard and the animal. A nearby resident reported a brief disturbance, then silence. Leonard was found later that afternoon after failing to return inside the residence. Authorities located the tiger near the property and euthanized it due to immediate risk. Inspection confirmed structural failure along the fence base, consistent with erosion and sustained pressure from the animal over time. The incident prompted a local review of private exotic animal containment standards in the region. What separates Leonard's case from every other story in this collection is geography. Every other incident happened inside an enclosure, in a space that was, at least in theory, designed to contain the risk. Leonard's happened outside, in open ground, because the boundary he had relied on had already failed before he arrived. The enclosure didn't hold, and by the time he reached the gate, the situation had already moved beyond it. It was October 7th, 2018. The hills had turned in the way eastern Kentucky turns in early October. The hardwoods going orange and rust along. The ridgelines, the mornings carrying a chill that hadn't been there a month before. The light sat lower and sharper across the hollow, where James Buckley's property sat back from the road. James was 47 years old. He was a coal equipment mechanic, spent his career on maintenance contract for the mining operations in Harlan County, known for fixing things others had written off. His wife Carol was the organizational center of the household, sharp where James was unhurried. Their teenage son Marcus had grown up working alongside his father, and Dale, the neighbor there that morning, was a longtime friend going back to when both men worked the same contract in the late 90s. James had raised a black bear from a cub after its mother was killed by a vehicle on a county road 3 years earlier. He kept it in an enclosure he built himself, never registered it, and named it Rue. It had grown into a full adult black bear, several hundred pounds. American black bears are highly intelligent and strongly food motivated, capable of forming associations between specific individuals and the delivery of food that persist across years, and that retention is not affection, it is conditioning. James had hand-fed Rue regularly and continued the practice as she grew. He entered the enclosure for feeding rather than using a pass-through. The boundary between keeper and food source had never been cleanly established, and nothing in 3 years had given anyone in that yard framework for what they were about to see. Rue had changed over the 3 years in ways that James had tracked practically. The size of her enclosure, the quantity of food required, the reinforcement schedule, but had not tracked behaviorally with the same precision. She was heavier and stronger in ways that were obvious. But the behavioral architecture underneath that physical growth, the deepening food conditioning, the accumulated pressure of years of enclosure entry feeding, was less visible precisely because it had developed so gradually. James had managed her successfully throughout, and successful management across time tends to produce its own blind spot. The feeding had been delayed that morning by about an hour and a half. Rue had been pacing the enclosure since her regular window had passed. James recognized the pacing. He had seen it before, and it had always resolved when he arrived with food. He went out to feed her with Carol on the porch, Marcus at the edge of the yard, and Dale leaning against the fence, watching. James entered the enclosure. Rue came toward him the way she always did, and that was precisely the problem. The movement that looked familiar was not the same movement it had been on other mornings. The delay, the food conditioning, the absence of any spatial boundary, it had all converged. The transition from approach to engagement happened in seconds, small enough that Marcus said he didn't register what he was seeing as an attack until it was already fully underway. Carol came off the porch the moment she understood. Marcus was at the gate seconds later. Dale tried to pull it open and couldn't get it unlatched, hands shaking, urgency working against the fine motor control the latch required. Carol went back to the house for the rifle. Marcus got the gate open. None of it was in time. James Buckley died in his enclosure with his family in the yard. Not random, not without precedent, just invisible. The way these dynamics are always invisible to the people closest to them, until the morning they aren't. What Carol and Marcus described in the weeks following was the specific difficulty of grieving something that had also been a part of their daily life. An animal they had known from when it was small enough to hold, that had eaten from their hands, that had been woven into the fabric of the property as completely as anything else on it. The loss was not clean. It carried a complexity that people outside that situation rarely have a framework for, and that complexity did not make the grief smaller. It made it harder to put down. It was October 8th, 2016. The golden autumn light filtered through the Tennessee mountains over a rented cabin near Gatlinburg, where a reinforced shed behind the property held a dangerous secret. 2.5 years of bottle feeding could never truly domesticate the 280-pound black bear inside. Stellan Morrow, 27, lived alone in the Smoky Mountain foothills, working part-time at a kayak rental shop and spending his days hiking and exploring the wilderness. In spring 2014, he found an orphaned black bear cub and, instead of contacting wildlife authorities, took her home. He named her Nola, bottle-fed her for over 2 years, and converted a storage shed into her enclosure, unaware that her natural instincts would soon outgrow his control. The shed sat 30 yards behind his cabin, surrounded by chain-link fencing that had been repeatedly repaired and reinforced after visible damage as Nola grew. American black bears are powerful predators, with adult females reaching 400 pounds, bite forces over 800 pounds per square inch, 2-inch claws, and bursts of speed exceeding 35 miles per hour. I can't imagine keeping such an intelligent animal confined. With memory and smarts rivaling primates, it seems impossible for captivity not to become stressful and dangerous. By October 2016, the warning signs were clear. Nola had become increasingly food aggressive, leaving deep scratches, and spent nights slamming against the shed walls, audible from Stellan's bedroom. His brother urged him to call authorities, but Stellan feared legal trouble and worried about Nola. The onset of hyperphagia, bear's pre-hibernation drive, made her desperate, irritable, and unpredictable. That afternoon, Stellan entered the shed with a bucket of apples and honey, intending to feed Nola as usual. The shed measured roughly 10 by 12 feet, visibly reinforced and worn from repeated impacts, and he left the door open to let in the autumn light. Nola waited in the back corner, panting heavily, her eyes locked on the bucket with the single-minded intensity of a predator driven by hunger. I can't help but imagine how calm Stellan must have felt, completely unaware of just how dangerous she had become. As he stepped closer, Nola rose onto her hind legs and struck the back of his head with crushing force. Her claws penetrated his scalp, fracturing bone and slamming his face against the doorframe. Before he could react, she clamped down across his upper body, jaws crushing into shoulder and neck, as she shook him with downward force. Stellan tried to escape, dragging himself a few inches, but she pinned him and began biting repeatedly into his head and torso. Adrenaline gave him strength to move, but his injuries escalated rapidly. Nola fractured ribs, punctured a lung, and tore through muscle and soft tissue. Within minutes, shock set in as blood loss and trauma overwhelmed his body. Driven by hyperphagic hunger, Nola remained over him, biting and mauling as the attack continued, before eventually beginning to feed on exposed tissue. The bear's pre-hibernation drive overrode any remnant of the bond Stellan believed they shared. Stellan's brother eventually grew concerned after 2 days of no contact and drove to the cabin, discovering the scene. He saw the blood trail first, then Nola lying beside what remained of Stellan and the overturned bucket. He stepped back and called authorities. Law enforcement and wildlife officers arrived promptly, tranquilizing Nola and documenting the scene. Investigators noted feeding behavior consistent with the attack and found Nola food-conditioned and nutritionally imbalanced despite her size. Stellan's death was ruled accidental. While authorities noted the illegal possession, no posthumous charges were pursued. Nola was euthanized the following day. The memorial was small, attended only by a few family members. Stellan's long-term project of caring for Nola was never publicly shared. A short local news article ran, omitting any mention of illegal captivity or the dangers of housing a wild predator. The shed, fencing, and claw marks were removed before the property was relisted. Reflecting on this, it is hard not to question how preventable the tragedy was. Stricter regulations on exotic animal possession and more public awareness might have stopped Stellan from bringing a predator into his home. At the same time, he ignored repeated warning signs, the aggression, the scratches, the nightly impacts, and failed to respect the risks inherent to a wild animal. Responsibility feels shared, a combination of human error and regulatory gaps that ended in a horrific, avoidable outcome. It was September 8, 2015, when the late summer heat hung thick over the small rural property outside Ocala, Florida. The modest 3-acre homestead was surrounded by palmetto scrub and pine trees, providing privacy for Lily Howard's unusual household. Lily, 31, lived alone with her most treasured companion, a 7-year-old male chimpanzee named Coco, who had the run of her converted garage and outdoor enclosure. Lily worked as a veterinary technician at a small animal clinic in town, but her true passion was primate rescue. She had acquired Coco legally 5 years earlier from a licensed exotic animal breeder during a window before Florida substantially tightened its primate ownership regulations. She cleared every hurdle with the confidence of someone who believed her veterinary background made her uniquely qualified. For the first 3 years, Coco was manageable, playful, affectionate, and bonded closely with Lily. She bottle-fed him, let him sleep in her bed, and treated him like the child she never had. But as Coco entered adolescence around age 5, his behavior shifted. Male chimpanzees undergo significant hormonal changes during this period, and Coco's playful nature transformed into something more aggressive and unpredictable. He began destroying furniture, throwing objects, and showing his teeth when frustrated. Lily excused these behaviors as teenage rebellion. Several primate experts had warned her that male chimps become nearly impossible to manage after age 7, but Lily insisted her bond with Coco was special. On the afternoon of September 8th, Lily had invited her colleague Rachel to meet Coco for the first time. Rachel arrived around 3 p.m., excited but nervous about meeting a full-grown chimpanzee. Lily assured her that Coco was friendly and well-behaved, leading Rachel into the converted garage where Coco spent most of his time. The space was filled with climbing structures, ropes, and scattered toys. Chimpanzees share over 98% of human DNA, but their physical capabilities far exceed ours. Adult male chimpanzees can weigh up to 150 pounds and possess significantly greater grip strength than humans of comparable size, owing to their higher proportion of fast-twitch muscle fibers. Their canine teeth can grow up to 1.5 inches long, capable of deep, tearing puncture wounds in soft tissue. During adolescence and adulthood, male chimps become increasingly territorial and prone to sudden, violent outbursts, especially when unfamiliar people enter their space or when they perceive threats to their dominance hierarchy. Coco was sitting on a wooden platform when the two women entered. His eyes immediately locked onto Rachel, and his lips pulled back slightly, a subtle sign of agitation. Lily misread this as a smile and encouraged Rachel to come closer. As Rachel stepped forward, Coco suddenly leapt from the platform onto a bookshelf, rattling the structure violently. Lily tried to calm him by approaching with a banana, but Coco swatted it away and began screaming, a high-pitched, ear-piercing sound that filled the garage. Rachel backed toward the door, but before she could reach it, Coco launched himself at Lily. The 120-pound chimpanzee moved with terrifying speed, covering the 12-foot distance in a single leap. He collided with Lily's upper body, and his powerful hands immediately grabbed her left forearm, twisting it with such force that both bones snapped audibly. Lily screamed and tried to pull away, but Coco's grip was unbreakable. Coco then turned his aggression toward Lily's face and hands, the characteristic targets in chimpanzee attacks. He bit down on her left cheek, his canines punching through skin and muscle and fracturing the zygomatic bone. He then seized her left hand, biting through the fingers and severing her index and middle fingers completely. A third bite tore into the soft tissue of her nose and upper lip, causing catastrophic facial trauma. Blood poured freely from multiple wounds, and Lily's screams became wet and ragged as blood pooled in the back of her throat. The relentless assault lasted approximately 90 seconds before Coco released his grip and retreated to the corner of the garage. Rachel had already called 911 from outside. Lily collapsed to the floor, blood pooling rapidly beneath her. The destruction of her nasal cavity and soft palate, combined with blood flooding her airway, made breathing nearly impossible. Lily lost consciousness within minutes, her brain deprived of oxygen by both blood loss and a completely compromised airway. By the time her body stilled, she had already gone into cardiac arrest. Emergency responders arrived 8 minutes after the 911 call, but they couldn't enter the garage while Coco was still present. An animal control officer arrived approximately 20 minutes later and tranquilized Coco from a safe distance. Once the chimpanzee was sedated, paramedics rushed in, but Lily had been without a pulse for over 15 minutes. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation revealed that Lily's exotic animal permit had expired 2 years earlier, and she had been keeping Coco illegally. Coco was transported to a primate sanctuary specializing in aggressive chimps. Lily's family filed a lawsuit against the original breeder, but the case was eventually dismissed. It was July 28, 2018, and the Louisiana summer was doing what Louisiana summers do, pressing heat and humidity into every corner of the day. The air thick enough that even standing still felt like effort. By late afternoon outside Baton Rouge, the light had gone gold and heavy, and the surface of the water in Eric Landry's backyard enclosure sat completely still, reflecting nothing. Eric, 38, had built the enclosure himself over the course of about 2 years, a 20-foot long, 4-foot deep structure with a water section that took up roughly half the total space. He was a detail-oriented man by nature, the kind of person who documented his builds and took quiet pride in doing things properly. Louisiana has a long-established alligator, farming and handling industry, and private ownership of American alligators, while regulated, existed within a framework that experienced handlers could navigate. Eric had the permits. He had the paperwork. What he had built was, on paper, compliant. The animal he kept inside it was an American alligator, approximately 11 feet long and over 500 pounds. A species that has remained essentially unchanged for 37 million years because nothing about its design needed improving. I think about that sometimes. An animal that has outlasted almost everything else on this continent, and someone decided to keep one in their backyard in Baton Rouge. American alligators are ambush predators, and their entire anatomy is organized around that single strategy. Their eyes and nostrils sit at the very top of the skull, allowing them to remain almost entirely submerged while maintaining full sensory awareness of the surface above. They can hold their breath for up to 2 hours. In murky water, they are functionally invisible, and when they strike, the movement from stillness to full contact is among the fastest predatory actions in the animal kingdom. Studies have clocked the initial lunge at under 150 milliseconds. The bite force of a large adult exceeds 2,000 pounds per square inch, among the highest recorded for any living animal. What follows the bite is the death roll, a full-body rotation used to disorient prey and drag it below the surface. It is not a defensive behavior, it is a feeding behavior. The water in the enclosure had developed significant algae and sediment buildup over the preceding weeks, reducing visibility below the surface to near zero. Eric was aware of it. Cleaning was on his list. But on July 28th, he entered the enclosure for a late afternoon feeding before the water had been cleared, approaching the waterline carrying food, in conditions that were meaningfully different from the ones he'd grown accustomed to. No overhead barriers, no external feeding system, no protected approach path had been installed. The enclosure was well built, but the safety architecture around the feeding process had never been completed. Eric was at the water's edge when the alligator came up from below the surface with no visible warning. The bite was immediate, followed by the death roll, a full-body rotation that pulled him toward the deeper section of the enclosure. Disturbed water, mud displacement, and drag marks told the story of what followed. He had no barrier between himself and the water. In conditions where he couldn't see the animal had seen him perfectly. A nearby resident reported a sudden splash and a brief disturbance, then silence. Eric was reported missing later that evening. Authorities searched the enclosure and recovered remains from the water. The alligator was euthanized due to immediate risk. The case was later referenced in regional safety discussions, though it received limited public coverage. What stays with me about Eric's case is the water visibility. That single factor, sediment and algae obscuring the surface, transformed a dangerous situation into a fatal one. He couldn't see the animal. The animal could detect him perfectly. That asymmetry in a shared space with no barriers left no margin at all. It's the kind of detail that seems almost incidental until you understand what it actually meant. It was August 4th, 2014. The heat sat over the land the way Central Texas heat always does in early August. Heavy, flat, radiating back up from the earth. On rural properties outside any municipal boundary, the afternoon carried the particular stillness of a place far enough from infrastructure that the world, beyond the fence line, barely registers. Ray Garza's property was that kind of place. He had built it to be. Ray was 51 years old. He had spent 20 years as a pipeline inspector in the oil and gas sector before an early retirement following a back injury. The rural property outside Bastrop was what he had worked toward. Land, distance, self-sufficiency. He was private but not unfriendly, the kind of man who helped without being asked and expected nothing in return. The tiger was consistent with who he was, an extension of the impulse to do something nobody he knew had done, on land he had earned. He had kept a Bengal tiger on his property for 6 years, acquired as a cub through back-channel connections in the private exotic animal trade. No permit, no registration. He called it Sultan. Bengal tigers are estimated by wildlife organizations to number in the thousands in private U.S. ownership, more held privately in Texas alone than exist in the wild across all of India. They reach full adult size between 3 and 4 years, with males regularly exceeding 200 kilograms, and their territorial range in the wild can exceed 100 square kilometers. An enclosure is not a territory. It is a compression of everything that territory is for. Sultan had become something of an open secret in Ray's world, not widely known, but known enough that a small orbit of people understood what was on that property and had made peace with it. Ray spoke about the tiger, the way people speak about things they have lived alongside long enough to stop fearing, not recklessly, but with the settled confidence of someone who had managed the situation successfully across years and had drawn conclusions from that success. 6 years without a serious incident is a long time. It is also, in the context of a fully grown Bengal tiger, exactly long enough to stop feeling like luck. The gathering that afternoon was a family event. Ray's wife, his adult son, 2 grandchildren under 10, a brother-in-law down from Austin. People who had seen Sultan before, who understood in the abstract that the animal was dangerous, but for whom that danger had been softened by repetition into something that felt theoretical. Ray fed Sultan in front of family routinely. Their experience said this was safe. The feeding that afternoon had been delayed by nearly 3 hours. In the management of large captive felids, a delayed feeding is not a neutral event. Bengal tigers operate on internal rhythms that do not flex easily around human scheduling, and the longer the delay, the more the animal's arousal builds towards something that is no longer simply hunger. Sultan had been pacing and vocalizing for over an hour before Ray went in. The signals were there, and the family gathered outside the fence was not trained to read them. Ray entered the enclosure with the feed. The attack came fast. His wife screamed. His son reached the fence and tried to get the gate open, but the latch, the same one that kept Sultan contained, now kept everyone else out. His brother-in-law ran for the house to find a weapon. The grandchildren were pulled back by instinct. It was over before the firearm was retrieved. What the family described afterward, and what families in documented big cat incidents across the United States have described in consistent terms, is the way the fence transformed the experience of witnessing into something different from ordinary helplessness. They could see everything. The distance between them and Ray at any given moment was measured in meters, not miles, and none of that proximity translated into the ability to do anything that mattered. Ray Garza died inside the enclosure in front of 5 members of his family. The investigation documented a privately kept, unregistered Bengal tiger, an illegal arrangement maintained in secrecy for 6 years, and a set of variables: delayed feeding, high ambient temperature, keeper entering during peak arousal, that the animal's behavioral state had been building toward all afternoon. No fence in the world keeps a family out faster than it keeps an apex predator in. It was April 23rd, 2018, when 47 investors watched in horror from conference rooms across Silicon Valley as a corporate meeting turned into chaos. The live video feed showing a 150-pound chimpanzee attacking inside a rural Oregon compound. Ezra Blackwood had retreated from human society following the 2012 sale of his app development company for $800 million, using his newfound wealth to purchase a 200-acre compound in rural Oregon, where he could indulge his obsession with exotic animals without interference from neighbors or authorities. The 41-year-old recluse had built an illegal private compound housing exotic animals, including Bengal tigers and venomous snakes. But his primary attachment was Caesar, a 12-year-old male chimpanzee acquired through illegal wildlife trafficking despite federal bans on private great ape ownership. Blackwood's isolation had deepened after his business partner's suicide the previous year, leaving him with limited human contact outside of routine investor calls. Blackwood kept Caesar as a companion, underestimating the risks of adult male chimpanzees in captivity. Male chimpanzees can develop severe behavioral instability, and Blackwood's only trained assistant had resigned after being bitten during feeding duties, leaving him without professional animal handling support. The compound's remote location, while preferred for privacy, also meant emergency medical and law enforcement response times were estimated at roughly 15 minutes. The home office was located beside the animal enclosures and separated by reinforced glass. Blackwood was aware that adult male chimpanzees can possess exceptional strength and bite force, and Caesar, weighing about 150 pounds, had shown increasing aggression in the months before the incident, though Blackwood had interpreted the behavior as manageable rather than warning of escalating risk. During a quarterly investor call attended by 47 participants, Caesar escaped his enclosure through a damaged lock that had not been repaired despite prior notice. The first sign of trouble came when Caesar appeared in the office doorway, his massive frame filling the entrance as he surveyed the room with the intelligence that made chimpanzees such formidable predators. Several investors commented nervously about the animal's presence, but Blackwood assured them that Caesar was harmless and well-trained. At first, Caesar's behavior seemed playful. He bounded into the office and leapt onto Blackwood's desk, scattering papers and sending a coffee mug crashing to the floor as the investors watched with uneasy laughter. Blackwood attempted to coax the chimp away with treats from a desk drawer, speaking in the soothing tones he had learned from animal training videos. When Caesar ignored the commands and Blackwood raised his voice, something primal triggered within the chimp. The transformation from playful to aggressive happened in seconds. Caesar's posture shifted, lips pulled back to reveal massive canine teeth, and his hair stood on end in the threat display that wild chimps use before attacking. The attack began when Caesar suddenly lunged from the desk onto Blackwood's shoulders, forcing him to the floor. The chimpanzee bit into the scalp area, causing lacerations and heavy bleeding. Blackwood attempted to push the animal away, but but Caesar used his hands and teeth to grip facial tissue, producing severe soft tissue injury, including removal of part of the left cheek. Blackwood tried to cover his face with his hands, but the chimpanzee's strength and speed prevented effective defense. The animal then bit the nasal region, causing complete removal of the nose and additional injury to the left eye area from claw strikes. Blackwood moved backward toward the office wall in a disoriented state due to blood loss and facial trauma. The incident occurred rapidly, with injuries consistent with a large primate attack. The video call participants later reported shock and attempted to disconnect after witnessing the assault. Paramedics arrived 18 minutes later, delayed by the remote location and confusion over the address. They found Blackwood alive, but catastrophically injured. Identification was only possible through dental records. He was airlifted to a regional trauma center, where surgeons worked 14 hours to stabilize him. Over the following months, he underwent 23 reconstructive surgeries, permanently losing his left eye and suffering irreparable damage to his jaw and sinus cavity. Authorities seized all of Blackwood's exotic animals, and Caesar was euthanized after experts determined he posed an ongoing threat. Blackwood survived, but was left barely recognizable, retreating further into seclusion. His case became a cautionary example of the deadly consequences of treating wild predators as pets.